Tizita Shoafaro, who gave us a journalist's perspective on the significance of Ethiopia's planned Bishoftu International Airport, its scale, its timelines, and its potential to position the country as Africa's aviation leader. Now let's turn to the business and economic lens. What will this mega project mean for Ethiopia's investment climate, job creation and tourism? And how will it shape regional and global connectivity? Well, for that, we're now joined by Ethiopian businessman, Mr. Negatu. Thank you so much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Peter, thank you for having me on your program.
So, from a business and investment perspective, how transformative could this airport be for Ethiopia's economy, in your view?
Right, it's a very good question. And I actually like to put it in context. As you know, Ethiopian Airlines is by far the largest airline in Africa and amongst the 30 largest in the world. And they just announced their results last week. Ethiopian Airlines owns the airports in this country. So, you just need to put that in context. Not every airline owns airports, but here in Ethiopia, the airline owns the airport. So last week they announced the results. They had transported 19 million passengers, something like $7.6 billion in revenue. And even though they didn't announce yet their profits, our analysts at CBE Capital are estimating to be around $1.2 billion in profits, which places them amongst the three most profitable airlines in the Middle East Africa region after Emirates and Qatar Airways. So you have to kind of put that in context to understand why Ethiopian Airlines is planning to build what will be not only Africa's largest airport, which is 110 million passengers, costing about $10 billion, but it will be, when it's at full occupancy, it will be amongst the 10 largest in the world. So that gives you the magnitude of what this project is all about. And it's going to start construction in October, in a couple months from now. And the first phase of 60 million passenger capacity will be completed in exactly 4 years. November 2029 is what the airline has indicated. I actually attended yesterday the agreement between the African Development Bank, which is the lead global financial arranger, and Ethiopian Airlines. So it was actually a very historic moment, not only for Ethiopia, but also for the African aviation industry. I mean, I spent more than 20 years on both the investment banking and the strategy side of it, working with African airlines, 14 of them actually. So we have a deep understanding what it takes. As you may know, airlines in Africa are very heavily challenged. I mean, in fact, except for Ethiopian Airlines, virtually no state-owned airline in Africa today makes money. That's an oddity. It's just very strange environment that we're in. Anyways, so Ethiopian Airlines is an outlier in terms of its success, its rapid growth. It has 160 aircraft, which is more than all other African airlines pretty much combined. Again, when people ask me, how is it possible for an African carrier to build one of the world's largest airports? It's because it's also one of the largest airlines, one of the most profitable airlines. And to give you a context, back in 2022, it was actually the most profitable airline in the world right after COVID. So this, I think, needs to be taken into context when we start talking about these very large mega projects. And aviation, in my view, and obviously we have a deep understanding. We've done a lot of M&A work in aviation, and whether it's Nigeria or Ghana, we helped set up Ethiopian Airlines. We advised Ethiopian Airlines in the first investment they made in an African airline called ASKY in Togo about 12 years ago. We had even looked at, possible collaboration between Ethiopian Airlines and South African Airways. I was down in South Africa a number of times to look at that opportunity. Maybe someday it will come to fruition. So the impact is beyond Ethiopia. Today, something like 80% of into and out of Africa travel is done by non-African carriers. Okay, that again should also give you an alarm bell, actually, because this wealthy continent with 1.5 billion people is today being served. 80% of it is being served by non-African carriers. Part of it is lack of infrastructure. Part of it is lack of investments in the aircrafts and other things, and the people side of it, from pilots, from cabin crew, from technicians. And most importantly, many African governments make it difficult for airlines to operate efficiently and profitably. I'm sorry to say that includes South Africa, by the way, because I remember when we started advising Ethiopian Airlines something like 20 years ago, when it was a small airline with 12 aircraft, SAA was 10 times bigger than Ethiopian Airlines. Look where SAA is today. As the wealthiest country in Africa, which is South Africa, doesn't have a viable flight carrier. It doesn't make any sense. Anyways, back to the point that you raised about
Yeah.
the impact of
So,
the airport is beyond Ethiopia. I think that's the message
all right.
that
So,
this big project is sending out.
all right. So when I think about hubs, I think about Dubai and what that's been able to do. Could this be an African Dubai and maybe help implement the single African air transport market and other African Union integration initiatives?
Right. So again, let me give you an interesting data. Today, actually, the largest air gateway into and out of Africa is Addis Ababa Bole Airport. It's not Dubai. It used to be Dubai, but over the last 4 or 5 years, Bole Airport here in Ethiopia and Addis has taken over that mantle, so to speak. So yes, it's a very good, valid point to raise. It's a very interesting point. Could Addis be? Addis Ababa is already there, but by expanding this to 110 million passengers, which would be about the same size as the new airport that they're building in Dubai, by the way, not the existing DXB, but they're building a new one just outside of Dubai, on the outskirts of Dubai. It's about 100 million passengers as well. So the new airport, which is called Abu Sera, which is the neighborhood. Abu Sera is the name of the neighborhood, and I think they're going to name the airport as well Abu Sera, which is actually a nice name, a nice catch name. Is going to be comparable to the new airport they're building in Dubai. So this actually, Africa as a whole should look at this as an enlightened moment, saying, you know what, we can do these big things. And then you also raised a very good point. The African skies, open skies in Africa. By the way, there was an agreement back in the 20 some years ago, a declaration called Yamoussoukro, which all African governments had agreed to open up their skies. It never really were really fully implemented. Every African country put like barriers for African carriers to operate within Africa. They made it very difficult. That's the point I was making earlier. So we need to dismantle these artificial barriers. Like, if we do business in Europe, for example. If you are a member of the European Union, any airline within the EU can fly out of any EU country unrestricted. That's what we need in Africa. Remember, 80% is still being served by non-African carriers. So these kinds of barriers, they need to go beyond slogans, open African skies, this and that. But in reality, every African carrier, most African governments, not all of them, but most of them, put barriers for other African carriers to come and service the domestic and international market efficiently. Let me give you some numbers. Air tickets in Africa are the most expensive in the world. Okay? The most expensive in the world. Does that make any sense? Absolutely not. It's because of all these barriers. So the airport initiative, Ethiopian Airlines initiative to become really serving Africa as an African carrier should need to be promoted, and many other African carriers should also be encouraged to come up the ranks to get to the level of Ethiopian Airlines and even grow bigger. And that's, I think, the kind of message media like you, investment bankers and deal makers like us have to promote, that it is not a threat to have a successful African carrier come and service African countries. The Europeans do it. In the United States, where I grew up, where we do a lot of business, that's the way it's done there. So why is Africa lagging and needs to be? Listen, if you want today, and this is a common stated statement, if you want to fly from one African country to another today, it's most likely you go to Paris or London and come back into Africa. This is a very illogical approach that we have, and that needs to stop.
All right. We're going to have to leave it there. I wish I could talk to you for longer. I think we probably have to pick up this conversation again in the very near future, because it's so, so important. But for today, thank you so much indeed for joining us on the program.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. That's Zemedeneh